Yo, what's up? Dr. Swole here, MD, pro physique athlete, back with another episode on Swole Radio. I'm joined again by Dr. Eric Helms, and we're going to be talking about fat loss today, really getting into the nitty gritty. And this is especially relevant because Eric is in contest prep right now and running an elite prep. So thanks for being on the show, Eric.
No problem. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah. This is going to be great. We're really going to get into the details of how to actually set up your diet for fat loss today. Last time we talked a bit more of the broad strokes setup of fat loss phases. So I was thinking to just start off, Eric, maybe telling the audience about your organization of the muscle and strength pyramids in terms of how you approach different variables of nutrition.
Absolutely. So for those who are not familiar, I created a kind of hierarchy of priorities called the muscle and strength pyramids for both nutrition and training. And the reason why I did that is because people get thrown so many clickbait sound bites, and even in the evidence-based community where it's mostly accurate information, it's all out of context and it's all marketed in such a way to make you think it's the most important thing ever. So you end up, it's kind of like someone who's just learning to juggle, who's got like two balls and they're going, okay, I get the basics. And then someone goes, hey, check this out, and just takes a bucket of balls and just throws them at them while they're doing that. And they inevitably end up dropping a bunch of the balls. They don't know which ones are important, and they're basically taking on too much and they don't know how everything fits together. So the hierarchy is pyramidal in structure, and I think of it kind of like an architect. Like you have your foundation and your base, which is most important, and the things you built on top of it should only be built once you've got the earlier level and the more important level built. So the muscle and strength nutrition pyramid is specific to muscle and strength. You could organize this differently if your goal was, health or performance, et cetera, rather than strength performance. And the very, very baseline level is, of course, energy balance. But even below that, something that encapsulates all levels is what I would describe as behavior and lifestyle. And we talked a lot about that in our last episode. We were talking about fat loss. So anyway, the first level is energy balance, because that's truly what dictates changes in mass. And ultimately, when your energy balance is incongruent with your goals, you can do a lot of the other things right, but it's going to make everything a little bit less effective in most cases. Obviously, if someone is very high in body fat and they're going on a pretty long-term fat loss journey, but they also want to build muscle, then that might be a caveat or a difference there, that they might be in a deficit or an extended deficit most of the time. But for the most part, for example, if you want to be putting on muscle mass, it'd be helpful to be in a calorie surplus. If you want to be dropping body fat while maintaining muscle mass, you probably want to be in a caloric deficit, etc. And from there, we have the constituent parts of energy balance, like where we get energy from in our diet, which is largely from the macronutrients, your protein, your carbohydrates, and your fat. That's the next level of the pyramid, the next important piece. That is the big picture kind of quote unquote quality of your energy, because there will be a difference on a low protein energy surplus versus a high protein energy surplus, or a high protein deficit or low protein deficit, etc. And then from there, we go on to the kind of the micro level quality of the diet. That is our micronutrients, fiber diet quality, quote unquote. This is kind of a discussion that I often bridge into eating foods rather than macros, which is an important thing that we do in the real world, rather than just focusing on, say, like vitamins and minerals. But of course, that is a large component of it as well. And then from there, we go into the temporal distribution of when we eat. So nutrient timing after micronutrients as we move up this hierarchical structure. And this encompasses pretty much everything from how many meals you eat per day, to do you have higher or lower intakes on different days of the week, to kind of big picture like diet periodization, if you will, to do you take weeks off from dieting, or do you have mini cuts, or are you running diet breaks during a diet, etc. So all the nonlinear dieting strategies, all the time-restricted feeding strategies that might be out there, and all the peri-workout nutrition strategies that might be out there, they're all kind of encapsulated in this level. And we're starting to see that, people talk about these a lot. And most of the time, they're talking about them because they're using it to modify, say, energy balance or your macronutrient intake. And ultimately, that's where they should be starting, right? time restricted feeding primarily is effective as a fat loss tool because you have fewer opportunities to eat. And we look at it empirically in the research, it typically results in people eating less calories and being in a calorie deficit. So once you know that and you understand that, then you can make better decisions about how you implement it, and you have less strict, rigid rules like, oh my God, I ate at 8 a.m. Did I ruin my diet? Well, no, the reason you were waiting to eat till 1 p.m. is because eating at breakfast includes more calories. So you could make that up if you were aware of that. And it becomes more of a behavioral strategy rather than thinking of it as this kind of golden goose and not understanding why it works, or buying into false narratives around why it works, something like autophagy or thermogenesis or something like that, right? And then after we actually get through nutrient timing, so when we eat, and then the quality of our foods is coming down, and then the content, big picture of our foods, the macronutrients and energy balance, at the very tippy top, the thing to consider that is actually optional. This is a part of the pyramid you don't need. You could absolutely have more of a Mesoamerican style pyramid. You could have an Aztec style, no top, right? But if you want to go Egyptian, you can, and that little last piece is the supplement tier. And it has a very minor impact in the broad scheme of things. And for the most part, the supplements that are effective for muscle and strength, the ones that have a good track record, you can count them on one hand. And it's mostly a cautionary tale about not wasting a lot of money, and especially for drug-free athletes who are drug tested, not going to Vegas and rolling the dice of potentially having an inadvertent drug test failure for trying something that would only have at best a 1% difference in the grand scheme of things, and potentially even be harmful based upon some of the sketchy supplement companies that are out there. So yeah, that's the overall structure of it. And like I said, I think just a big reminder that all of it gets encapsulated into behavior and lifestyle. But yeah, that's the muscle and strength organizational structure and hierarchy.
That's great. It's a good broad overview, and we're not going to be discriminating on pyramids, but we're going to be sticking to the Egyptian for today. And
Yeah,
I think you're just getting into some of the nitty gritty of setting up your diet. So I think it would make sense to start off with calories at the bottom. So I think one of the first questions to answer would be, how do you find your maintenance calories and know where they're at?
absolutely. And there are a couple ways of doing this. The quick and dirty one that most people are aware of is I go on a website and it has like a energy balance calculator, and it asks me to enter my height, weight, sometimes my age, sometimes my gender, sometimes, or sex, I should say, sometimes my body fat percentage as an estimation. And then I estimate an activity level, and it spits out maintenance calories. And in an ideal world, it tells you, hey, this is based upon this published equation, and here you go. The issue with that, though, is that when we look at actual empirical data, so for example, we've got this huge database that is now available to people on the doubly labeled water method in thousands of people now. And we can see just the extreme amount of variance at the same body weight, in the same sex, at the same age between individuals. Not that this is like the norm, but I remember I wrote about this in Mass. You can find the same person maintaining their weight at 4,000 calories and 1,800 calories for a male who's about average weight, and that is important because this is easy to get wrong, and it's not fully explained by activity either. So there's a lot of individual differences here, and even if it is fully explained by activity, which it's not, a large part of it is, we're not great at actually estimating what our activity levels are, especially with the typical way that these equations are pitched to us or presented. When you do your activity modifier against your BMR type of thing, which is built in different ways to these websites, it'll typically say something like, lightly active, moderately active, sedentary, highly active. And the descriptors are things that are difficult for people who exercise to fit into. So for example, moderately active might be you're sedentary, but you have a very active job, or you have an office job, but you exercise, X number of days per week. And the challenge there is that almost all the people listening to this podcast are training at least 3 days per week. And they don't, but some of them have sedentary jobs and some of them have manual labor jobs, right? Mm-hmm. So where do they fit? And that is a challenging question to ask. And it also fits on the backdrop of what we're understanding more and more now, the constrained model of energy expenditure, which is as you do more quote unquote activity, you see your total daily energy expenditure come down. So it's not this perfectly linear additive thing. So ultimately, it is a bit of a guess when you use this method. So preferable to using any kind of calculators, the best way to do it is to actually track real data. And this serves a very important purpose because most of the time, the challenge that people run into when they are using a more quantitative approach to setting up their nutrition and their diet is they've never done it before. They don't necessarily know how to track and weigh their foods. They don't know how to do it in such a way that is conducive to life. They've never really done it before. So the process of simply just going through their eating behavior on a day-to-day basis and seeing, all right, what are the foods I normally eat? Let me not change my behaviors and just track. That shows them, oh man, my tracking skills maybe aren't too great. And most people underestimate their caloric intake. So there are benefits, you could say, like side tangential benefits to going through this process of going, all right, I'm going to spend 3 weeks, maybe 4 weeks, or even at least 2 weeks of getting up in the same condition, nude after I use the toilet, weighing myself every morning, getting a weekly average of my body weight, and then also tracking my intake to the best of my ability, getting a food scale, and figuring out what my energy intake is on average. And then I can look and go, okay, well, what did my body weight do over this 2 to 4 week period? And then what was my energy intake over this 2 to 4 week period? And then also learn, oh man, like tracking is a little harder than I thought, or man, just the active tracking is modifying my behavior, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And, there's a whole lot we could talk about as to how do you make sure that your tracking is more accurate. But this is somewhat not a huge issue, even if you're inaccurate in your tracking, because if you have a relatively stable eating behavior schedule, and like your 4 weeks that you track or your 2 weeks that you track represents how you're eating and the environments you're eating in and the foods that you eat normally, and it's not super chaotic, which I don't recommend. I think you should have a relatively stable approach to eating. There should be structure, even though there's flexibility, which we'll talk about in a bit. It will be reliable. And reliability just means that even if it's invalid, you think you're eating 2,000 calories, you're actually eating 2,400, that's fine. That should be a relatively stable error. And you're just basing it off the information you have. So, okay, hey, my body weight stayed the same, or it was going down slightly and I was eating 2,000 calories. It was actually 2,400. Who cares, right? And then from there, you can go, okay, my maintenance calories are, and you can determine based upon the loss in body weight, if we use the rough 3,500 calorie rule per pound of body weight change, you can get yourself much closer than one of these calculators would to determining what your maintenance energy intake is. And then from there, you can go, okay, what's my goal? Is it losing weight or is it gaining weight? And then where should I set my energy intake up to do that?
Yeah, I really like that method where you're ultimately relying on data that is more reflective of what's actually happening in the total system in aggregate.
Yep.
And rather than trying to plug things into some calculator online. And, it's almost more of a like moving target, guess and check style method where it's very useful to be able to track back. And even if your weight is changing, you can still have an estimate of where you are.
Absolutely. I would also point out, just to link to our last episode, that you can do this without necessarily tracking your calories too. You can just follow hunger and satiety cues and ratings, either quantifying them or just doing it more qualitatively, and being in a more or less satiated state post meals, depending upon your goals, to result in the change in body weight that is appropriate in terms of the rate of weight loss or weight gain for you that you want to see on a biweekly basis, for example. And just make sure that the meals themselves, quote unquote, look like what's appropriate for a bodybuilder to hit these macronutrient targets. You can kind of follow like the athlete's plate as an example, great resource. And adjust the portion sizes till you reach a certain level of satiety or hunger post meal. And you should be, basically a little hungry all the time if you're trying to cut, or relatively satisfied or full, depending upon the food you eat and your personal experiences and physiology if you're trying to bulk. And over time, if the scale weight confirms that you're losing between 0.5 to 1% of your body weight per week during a cut, you're in the money. And if you're gaining at a rate of, half to a quarter of that, you're in the money. So It doesn't necessarily require you to get like, MyFitnessPal or something like that.
Yeah, that's a good caveat for people where ultimately you want to be able to be as sustainable as possible. Going on to setting up your calories for an initial fat loss phase, let's say someone's starting out in maintenance, how would you recommend they initially change their calories to start losing weight?
Yeah, so I generally think the data would support the idea that falling between a 0.5 to 1% of body mass loss per week on average is what seems to be associated with being able to minimize losses in lean mass and minimize losses in strength, depending on what your goal is. And there's recent meta-analysis that broadly supports this, that found more than a 500 calorie deficit per day, you're probably seeing potential for lean mass losses. That wasn't necessarily in people training super effectively, et cetera. But yeah, that's kind of right in that ballpark based upon the average weight of people. So faster is not necessarily better, and depending upon the goal and how lean or how long you're going to diet for, there's arguments to be made for slower or faster at the start, right? So nonetheless, it's a good general rule. And if we operate off of the estimation of there being roughly 3,500 calories in a pound of fat, then we can start to create a deficit around that. So, if someone weighs 100 kilos or 220 pounds, they could set up a pretty large deficit to lose up to 2.2 pounds, per week, or 1 kilo per week. And then you just have to look at how feasible is that when you look at what that actually produces. If you're relatively sedentary as a 100 kilogram person, that might only be like an 1,800 calorie diet. And you might be coming out the gates fast and strong and able to lose a fair amount of fat all at once. But you might also be finding that diet is harder to follow, difficult to get in a sufficient amount of fruits and vegetables and protein and fat all at the same time. And that something more appropriate, like a 500 calorie deficit, would be better for you, or something slightly between those two numbers. However, if you're a pretty active 100 kilo person, you might be able to consume 2,500, even 3,000 calories and still be in a relatively large deficit. So this is something where you have to kind of individualize, and it does connect with the rest of the levels. But in general, what you're using is that rough estimation. If you have a 500 calorie deficit per day, that gets you to a 3,500 calorie deficit per week, which gets you to a pound of fat loss. And you can extrapolate that based upon your body mass and falling in that 0.5 to 1%. And then as we move up the tier, we might decide to organize that differently across days. We could even organize that with pre-planned diet breaks, et cetera, refeeds, so there's a lot of ways to do it. And then we also figure out, where do we get those calories from in the next level from the macronutrients.
Mm-hmm. What kinds of scenarios would you think about higher rates of loss?
Yeah, generally, if someone is higher in body fat, they can sustain a faster rate of weight loss. There are limits to this, though, because you don't necessarily see linear scaling with body mass and energy expenditure. So if you're someone with a lot of weight to lose and you just try to absolutely steamroll it and go as fast as possible, that can create a really unsustainable diet. And we also have to consider energy availability, which is a related concept to energy balance. But energy availability is essentially ensuring that you have enough energy for physiological processes to be healthy and functional, and not starting to downregulate because you're not providing enough relative to your lean body mass and your activity level. So you can actually calculate your energy availability by getting a rough estimate of your lean body mass, a rough estimate of your exercise activity expenditure, and then figuring out how many calories you're consuming after reducing exercise activity expenditure per kilogram of lean body mass. And you probably want to start a diet no lower than 30. That's sometimes challenging if you're pretty sedentary or just have a low energy expenditure. But if you can run a large deficit and still be at 30 or higher, as a general rule, you're probably not going to see some of the negative side effects that are the quote unquote downside of trying to diet too quickly. It won't be necessarily unsustainable, and you might be able to lose fat faster in the beginning. And there are some data that are not necessarily robust in all arenas, where faster weight loss initially predicts greater success later. And that is specifically in people with obesity. Again, that's not something that I think is necessarily generalizable, but it has been observed. I think for the most part, it should really be based on an individual level. And once you start to construct the diet in that range, you need to look at it. Is this feasible? And what are my goals? And ultimately, a lot of the times, the people who want to lose weight fast have a lot of weight to lose. And their goal is to eventually maintain that weight loss. And it's not a perfect fit, right? At least not long term. You can start fast, but then you need to start closing that energy gap to something more sustainable, because the goal of the diet is in part eventually to teach you maintenance behaviors. And a diet that's having you lose like 1.5% of your body weight per week, and having you eat, bare minimum kind of skeleton of a diet, like I have a fruit, a vegetable, and a lean protein source 3 times per day and a protein shake, and that's it. You can't live like that. You won't live like that, the data would suggest. And if that's the only way you know how to diet, then you're just going to go back to what you did previously that got you to the place where you needed to diet in the first place. So it makes a whole lot more sense to maybe come out the gates like that. And then once you start to experience any degree of diet fatigue, throwing 500 calories back into your diet and then just going slower and going, oh, I see. Now I can, incorporate this. I can do a little bit of cooking. I'm more satiated. This feels more sustainable. And adopting the mindset of, okay, if I have a lot of fat to lose and I plan to maintain it long term, I have my whole life to do that. I shouldn't necessarily be in a rush if that's actually going to make that goal at risk by taking that mentality.
Yeah, I really like that, where ultimately you want to be thinking with the long term in perspective. And this alludes back to our last conversation, where people will look at bodybuilders and just be like, oh, some oats, some fruit, some vegetables, some chicken breast. That's how I got a diet, and just completely upturn their lives for like a couple months and then end up sliding back into old habits.
Absolutely.
And I also like that, that you talked about how there are different aspects to this, where there are some pros and cons of, different rates of loss, where someone might actually benefit initially from a relatively faster rate of loss if they're able to sustain it. And I do find that, it gives you a lot of motivation if you can start seeing some results early on, but that it can also become unsustainable. And I kind of have this approach where I'll say that you want to aim to lose fat as quickly as possible in a sustainable way, where you're not losing muscle ultimately.
100%. I totally agree. And
for this, it'll depend on someone's experience level as well, where as an advanced athlete, for me, I can kind of switch over into a very steep deficit, relatively steep, and not really feel terrible about it and still carry along my day and be productive. Whereas for some other people, when I remember with my first diet, that starting off with a steep deficit just destroyed me.
Yeah, and I think another thing that more advanced dieters learn is that it's a process of give and take. So if you're running a steep deficit, that there's an expiry date on that. There's a refeed around the corner, or once you get leaner, you're going to slow it down. Or it's because you're running a mini cut that's only going to last X number of weeks. It's phasic. And I think that's not something that a lot of novice dieters understand, know, or kind of have ingrained. And they've also never walked, in those shoes before. So I think if you look at the data on acceptance-based therapy, it's far more effective for long-term weight loss maintenance and just the active weight loss phase itself. And that's really just kind of, as we might say, accepting the suck, as competitors. And obviously it's far more complex than that, and actual psychologists and clinicians deliver this. But acceptance-based therapy indicates that you have to some degree understand what's coming, accept it, know it, and then move forward. And that is a lot easier to do when you have experience with the process, which is why people work with coaches too. So I think for first-time dieters, coming out the gate super, super hardcore is generally a bad idea. But they often don't know that. That's why they're doing it in the first place. So hopefully if there's someone out there listening, they can learn from our experiences that, trying to diet too fast when you don't even have really the diet skills to know how to manage hunger, manage energy levels, and tell yourself this too shall pass, and know when to pull back and refeed or do a diet break, or how long your diet should last, or how long it'll take, or like what does a visual change correlate to in terms of scale weight changes. You just feel constantly uncertain and insecure in the process. And that's generally a bad combination because it increases your physique focus, which increases your anxiety, which increases your attempt to try to go faster, which increases your food focus. And then, this train is going off the rails.
Yeah, I think people don't realize how much of a skill set dieting is, where they kind of see it as, oh, it's just like a set of numbers. So it's like it's macros, or I just change my foods and automatically like the scale starts going down. But, when I switch over into a mini cut, like there are a lot of subtle things that I change in my life to like facilitate that, where maybe I'll have refeeds and I'll schedule all my like social activities on those refeed days. I'll rearrange my workouts, change my exercises for better SFR, change my foods that, finding things that I know that will make me as satiated as possible, and the distribution of those foods to suit my own kind of physiology. And that's something that you need to figure out over time. It takes experience.
Absolutely.
So for some of the more advanced bodybuilders out there who maybe want to run some mini cuts, or they're a bit more aggressive, how fast can you lose weight before you lose muscle?
Yeah, I mean, this generally, the faster you lose, the more likely you are. And the leaner you are when you're trying to lose fast, the more likely you are to lose muscle. And the less effective your training can be, the more likely you are to lose muscle. Also, if you're not able to maintain a sufficient energy balance, energy availability, protein intake, or sufficient carbohydrate or fat intake, all of those things can go into it. We have data on too low of fat intakes, disrupting to a small degree, hormonal balance, right? I don't think that's going to matter for a mini cut. In fact, I'm almost certain it won't. But we definitely have data on far larger changes in response to just not eating enough calories. Having an energy availability that's too low can immediately start to create problems. We see capped muscle protein synthesis when you start to have a very low energy intake. And in lean people, we see an elevation in muscle protein breakdown when you have a pretty large energy deficit. And we have meta-analytic data showing you can do a little more volume in training when you have peri-workout carbohydrates. So if you're on a really low calorie diet and you can't have enough carbohydrate, you barely get your protein into an acceptable range, your energy availability is too low, and you're lean, which seems to have differential impacts. There's another meta-analysis where you take men with obesity or overweight and you put them into an energy deficit, and you either see neutral or positive outcomes for testosterone. But if you do that with lean individuals, you see pretty consistent reductions in testosterone, just as an example. You also see different metabolic changes. There is a classic study from the 90s by, I think, Elias, where you put men with obesity on a 3-day starvation diet, and another one by Suryan Anara. I can never pronounce that last name. But between these two studies, you see divergent responses. So you see increase in using protein for fuel in lean men and a drop in testosterone across these two studies. And you see really no change metabolically in terms of protein utilization in men with obesity. And you see like either no change or an increase in testosterone. So the basic idea here is that, okay, well, the mini cut makes sense if you're deep in the off season and you're just quickly cleaning up some fat and you're going to get back into it. That kind of acts as like a buffer, but I still wouldn't generally go faster than maybe 1.5% of body weight per week.
Okay.
And I would restrict that to probably, if you're doing the faster rates, like 4 weeks. If you're going to lose a little slower, then you can go to 6 to 8. Anything longer than that's no longer a mini cut, like you're dieting,
Yeah. And then in terms of actually tracking things, how do you know that you're losing muscle?
You won't, honestly, especially if you're deep in the off season doing a mini cut. If your performance is holding on, that's probably the best sign. But you're going to look flat. And when you're like high in body fat and you look flat, you will look smaller, and you won't look that much better at the end of a mini cut. You look a little bit better. You will typically know like 2 to 3 weeks after a mini cut, once your glycogen is restabilized. And if your strength is the same or higher, and you lost a fair amount of weight and you look better after the mini cut, mission accomplished is kind of the best way to think of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because it can be tricky, especially with all the changes in glycogen and water and all that when you're in a deficit.
It also probably doesn't matter if you lose a little bit of muscle when you're going through a mini cut. There's only so much that's going to happen in a 4-week deficit if you're resistance training. So this isn't something I would worry about too much, to be honest. If you go outside of the ranges we're talking about, then sure, then it's just like a bad idea. Like if you just eat like 150 grams of protein per day in veggies and nothing else for 4 weeks, like, yeah, you're going to lose some muscle and you're going to feel pretty shitty. But why would you do that? So yeah, I think generally, even if you are on the extreme end, you're losing 1.5% of your body weight per week, and you do that for 4 weeks, but you do everything else right, and you feel a little off and your strength goes down a little bit. Let's say you lost, half a pound of muscle. I would suspect that within 3 weeks it's back on your body. Muscle memory is a real thing. Temporary reductions are temporary, and trained lifters just don't atrophy that quickly. And when they do, it generally comes back. The only instance where that's not true is when you go through contest prep, and it takes months just to get your body back into a position where it's able to resynthesize some of that muscle. Because you're so hormonally out of whack, you can't sleep. You got 1/3 of your normal testosterone levels. Your estrogen's so low, you're no longer having a menstrual cycle. But once you're back to having your regular menses, you don't feel just randomly lethargic. You can sleep through the night, then you're probably well on your way. And within weeks of effective training, you're probably going to get back to your off-season levels of muscle mass, especially if your body fat is back up to, a healthy but not, super low, point.
Yeah, it's well put, where some of these variables will depend on the actual body fat percentage state that you're in, where as you get into these really extreme levels of body fat, like late in contest prep, then some of the above mentioned points may not apply. Ascending the levels and going to the next stage, talking about macronutrients. I want to do a deep dive into this, and this will be of interest for a lot of people. Maybe starting off with protein. How should people approach protein for fat loss?
Yeah, protein is probably best figured out in terms and as a proportion of your body mass. This is only challenging if you're someone who's really high in body fat, because then your body mass is overall disproportionate to the amount of lean body mass you have, which is the main reason we're eating protein, right? Is to support lean body mass accrual. So when we look at, now we've got like 4 or 5 meta-analyses that have all kind of basically told us the same thing, that right around 1.5, 1.6 grams per kilogram of body mass of protein per day is right where we start to see a plateauing of any beneficial effect, at least for strength and muscle mass accrual. There's of course some variability and individual variation around this. For the Americans, that's about 0.7 grams per pound. And there's really no harm in going higher outside of clinical issues. And in some cases, there might be a benefit if you find you're a little more satiated eating higher protein diets, if you find your energy levels are more stable, or you just happen to be someone who responds better than that. Hard to tell. But for the most part, these are small effects anyway. So generally, I advise kind of setting a lower end threshold. If you're very, very serious about your goals, this is Swole Radio, then I would probably set it around that point, 0.7 gram per pound or 1.6 grams per kg of protein. Now, a really important thing is that if you're at 1.4, 1.5, or even 1.3, we're talking about a minuscule difference in the grand scheme of things. Despite the importance that people in the industry put on protein, it does matter, but the overall effect sizes are just not that high. So, that's why it's taken meta-analyses to actually estimate this point, because sometimes you'll see non-significant differences in a low protein diet versus a moderate protein diet, but they all tend to lean in favor of higher protein diets. So a general range that I recommend for people is about 0.7 to 1 gram per pound, with that not necessarily being, and it's better to be higher, just as a general range. When dieting, for the reasons I stated before, especially when leaner, we start to see a greater reliance on protein for fuel, increases in muscle protein breakdown as you get leaner. And like I mentioned, there is some degree of additional satiety on a macronutrient versus macronutrient comparison. So it might be beneficial to have a higher protein diet when dieting. So I generally kick these recommendations up to something like, 0.8 gram per pound up to like 1.2 grams per pound. or like 1.8 grams per kilogram all the way up to, 2.5, 2.6 grams per kg is a general recommendation. Important to remember that you can only kind of get the benefits of higher satiety to a point, because while we can compare macros, like what's more satiating, a gram of fat, a gram of carbohydrate, or a gram of protein, we don't eat macros, we eat foods. So like if you were to say, all right, what if I had a calorie matched amount of broccoli versus, protein that moved me from 1.6 all the way up to 2.5 grams per kg? That's a crap ton of broccoli, like if that's a difference in 70 grams or 75 grams of protein, that's 300 calories. 300 calories of broccoli is like 4 big ass bowls of broccoli that you could have in each one of your meals, right? It's also an impressive amount of farting. So I don't necessarily recommend that, but I would say you probably only want to push protein so high, kind of leverage that to the degree that it's leverageable. And then if you're still struggling with satiety and you're not dieting too quickly, you'd probably want to look into what are my food choice selections, where's my fiber at, can I get more fruits and veggies into my diet, rather than, well, let's push my protein to 4 grams per kg, because that's just going to displace your carbohydrates and fats and potentially actually make things worse. So that's why I do think there should be an upper end cap, and I would probably put that around like 3 grams per kilogram. So that's protein. And from there, you are now getting into like the energy providing macronutrients. Not that we don't get energy from protein, it's just that it's predominantly used to support lean body mass retention. And I'd never finished my whole what do you do if you're very high in body fat thing. So if you can estimate your lean body mass, if you can get a decent idea of, it doesn't even have to be perfectly accurate, of your body fat level, and you can figure out what your lean body mass is, you can therefore calculate what should my protein be per kilogram of lean body mass. And what you can do is just increase those values by about 25% to kind of correct for that. And then that will get most people in a similar ballpark. Another kind of cheat code, and this is something that Andy Morgan figured out, that unless you're really, really tall or really, really short, so I'd say if you're between like 5'4" to 6'1"-ish, this works. Your height in centimeters will typically provide a protein intake within the ranges we're talking about, which is kind of a nice little cheat code. And that's because there's a known relationship between height and weight. So even if you're very, very high in body mass, because if you have a very high body fat, but you're say 170 centimeters, 170 grams of protein, that might be right in the right range for someone of that height, kind of on the higher end, right? So it seems to work out nicely. I don't have empirical data to back it up. It's just a nice way of getting around having to calculate your body fat percentage and just giving you a reasonable target that is scaled somewhat to your body dimensions.
Yeah, a couple questions about protein. For yourself, when you're coaching athletes, how do you have their protein change between the off season and contest prep? Like, do you find prep protein goes up or goes down or stays the same?
Pretty similar most of the time. I'm just a little more encouraging of them to set like that lower end threshold as a let's stay above this, because you don't have kind of that caloric surplus to kind of bolster you. So I am totally fine. I'm actually more and more these days less likely to give someone specific macro targets and more likely to give them intake minimums for the macros and then a target calorie intake, because then they have more flexibility and they can adapt it to their environment. So for example, during prep, I might say, hey, all right, 1.8 grams per kg minimum protein intake per day. Minimum fat intake, I want that to be 30 grams. And ideally, I want you to be at least 20% of your calories or higher. Minimum carbohydrate intake, I want you to be at, say, at least, if you can get 3 grams per kilogram, great. If that's not possible, whatever remains after you get your fat and your protein in. And then they can play with it. And as far as the minimum intake for carbohydrates, maybe 1 gram per pound, 2 grams per kg, if possible. Just knowing that at a certain point, you're going to have to rob Peter to pay Paul for many competitors, and one of your macros is going to be lower than you want it because your calories are lower than you want it to be. So during prep, protein typically stays the same or goes up. The times it goes up are when someone in the off season really struggles to get in enough calories when they have a high protein intake, and they're kind of skirting the lower end. So they're always consuming like 1.5, 1.6 grams per kg. They're on like the low end of the protein. And then during prep, I bump them up, a bit, 0.1, 0.2 grams per kilogram, and go, okay, that's the minimum threshold. And that's generally a non-issue because they're not satiated, even in the start of the diet, and they don't find it an issue, and they're not trying to get in as much carbohydrates and fat and just total overall calories. And then we're just like, hey, let's make sure we don't go below this threshold. Let's stack our chips in the favor of maintaining muscle mass.
Mm-hmm. Another thing about protein, people talk about speed of digestion of different protein sources. Does that matter?
Probably not. It doesn't really seem to matter in terms of any kind of muscle or strength outcome. Like when you look at different comparisons between like casein and whey, if you look at long enough time courses in the context of a mixed diet, there's no clear winner there. And even when you look at vegan diets, which have very different digestion kinematics, so long as you're consuming enough throughout the day, all these minute differences we see in acute studies, differences in protein quality, differences in protein synthesis in an acute sense, those go away so long as you're consuming at least the ranges we're talking about and having at least 3 meals per day and doing resistance training. So those are generally things that I wouldn't worry about. The only times I would concern yourself with them is when you're going to consume the meals themselves. So if you're going to work out at 10 a.m. and you get up at 8, you probably wouldn't want to have a really heavy, fiber-heavy, slow digesting. Like you wouldn't want to eat like Greek yogurt and like muesli and oats first thing in the morning. That'll keep you full and satiated. But if you got to work out in 2 hours, that's going to be like a rock in your stomach and making you feel bloated and uncomfortable. But that might be a perfectly good meal as, post-workout or something like that. Especially if you had a pre-workout meal that was fast to digest, you're going to have those amino acids already in you. The only other time I might think about it is if you train first thing in the morning fasted, I would probably get a faster digesting protein post-workout. If you absolutely insist on not having anything before you train, because now you're stacking periods of fasting on top of one another. The period of time you slept since your last meal that you had the day prior, and then training on an empty stomach. And then, okay, now we actually have a reason to try to get in something that's going to start that build and repair process a little earlier. But those are pretty edge cases in most instances.
Yeah, cool. So yeah, that covers protein. Going on to carbs, I guess, would be another macro to talk about. Sure. What are your thoughts on, higher versus lower carb approaches for fat loss?
Ultimately, I think it is very individual. When we look at the collection of all the data and the decades of diet wars, there's never been a clear winner. We understand that going way too low in carbohydrates or way too low in fats causes issues either way. We've got meta-analyses showing that a low-fat, high-protein diet can suppress testosterone. We also have meta-analyses showing that a low-fat diet can suppress testosterone in men, as an example. We see some associations in women who experience symptoms of REDS, that can be impacted by very low carbohydrate intakes. It's confounded by the energy intake side of it. It's hard to tell. And we see generally adherence gets threatened anytime you start to remove any singular macronutrient. And we see that the thing that predicts success the most in dieting is adherence, right? So generally, most people are going to do best with adherence when they're in some kind of moderate intake range. Now, what moderate is relative to your goals. So for physique athletes, for people lifting weights, for strength athletes, that needs to be sport supportive, right? So for bodybuilders especially, we do a fair amount of moderate volume work in the grand scheme of the athletic performance. It's higher volume than a powerlifter, doesn't mean it's necessarily high volume. So, when we've done our best to come up with a reasonable carbohydrate intake for not specifically dieting, but just generally to support training, in the literature, we kind of landed on like 3 to 5 grams per kilogram, or the minimum of 3 grams per kilogram of carbohydrates per day as a minimal intake, which will generally fit into most energy intakes. not necessarily always without pushing fat lower than you'd want with the protein set where we want. So in some cases, you will be forced to eat insufficient, or I should say suboptimal carbohydrate or fat, for periods of time, or at least on some days. So I think that's a general kind of minimal intake that I like to prescribe, just knowing that it has to go lower. But generally what I do is I allow carbohydrates to be the remaining intake after someone has established a protein and fat intake. So yeah, those are not that this means a whole lot, but fats and proteins, there's essential amino acids and essential fatty acids. Carbohydrates are not quote unquote essential. So in terms of just kind of thinking about, let me set things up for the priority of life, I will often, encourage people to figure out what their fat intake should be, what their protein intake should be, and then the remaining amount is assigned to carbohydrate. And that often reflects their overall energy status as well. If there's someone who's relatively sedentary, doesn't burn a whole lot of calories, they set up the protein, they set up their fat, they won't have a whole lot left for carbohydrate, and that's probably fine because they're not very active. Somebody who clocks 15,000 steps per day, works out 6 days a week, and has an active job, they set up their fat, they set up their protein. Protein's going to be scaled to body mass, not activity. They're going to have a lot remaining for those things, and then they can adjust those two values, fat and carbohydrate, based upon personal preference.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And then what are your minimum requirements for fat?
Yeah, there's actually some recent really good work that Dr. Trexler did in this in Mass, where he went and actually figured out what are some good values. And prior to this, I just kind of had some stuff I'd pull out of my butt on what seemed to be associated with like a good idea. I could throw some mechanisms at you and be like, hey, like fats are important for fat soluble vitamins, and fats are important for stimulating cholecystokinin and being a little more satiated. And, fats are important, for metabolic function as well as, sex hormone production. And then you'd be like, well, how much do you need for those things? I'm like, I don't know. I got to go, because it's not very clear. Mm-hmm. But Trex did a deep dive on this, and he looked at some of the data on historical, like very low energy intake diets and what happens in clinical situations and what fat intake do you need to prevent complications. And in the range of like 7 to 12 grams is the minimum amount you need to prevent gallbladder stones, right? So, and that's it when you look at the medical diets to prevent like an acute issue that happens in the order of weeks, is a few grams of fat so you don't get gallstones, right? So as you know, as a medical doctor, gallbladder secretes bile. It helps with the digestion of fat. You get a really low fat diet, feedback loop. You're not producing as much gallstones, bad news bears, right? So to prevent medical complications, your minimal fat intake, real low. Then the question becomes, well, okay, I'm not here just to prevent a acute medical incident. I'm here to, support my health and lean body mass retention. So then if you start looking at the data on, okay, well, what do we need to provide sufficient, fat intake for fat soluble vitamins to be taken up? And what do we need to actually provide sufficient number of essential fatty acids? And now you start to get a number that is somewhere in the 20 to 30 gram range, not necessarily scaled to body mass, but more kind of a general kind of range of intakes. And that is sufficient to prevent a loss or rather prevent you from not getting enough essential fatty acids and from being able to, process your micronutrients. But it does require a lot of care to make those 20 to 30 grams go as far as you need to, because they have to come from, largely essential fatty acids. You're probably consuming, fish or fish oils or vegan equivalents like algae oils. You're probably paying very close attention to both getting omega-6s and omega-3s, the ones that we cannot produce endogenously. And it's hard to only consume 20 to 30 grams of fat. Like if you try to consume a zero fat diet, most of the time the trace fats will get you up to 10 to 20 grams right there. So then you're going, all right, I'm eating, veggie and lean proteins, like pretty much fat-free dairy, chicken breasts, canned tuna, turkey breast, and maybe some vegetarian proteins that are, like also carb sources, like your lentils or things like that. And I've only got 10 grams of fat left to make sure that I'm good to go. All right, I'll take a fish oil supplement and then and then I'm there, right? So at that point, you're topped out, and you're going fat as low as you possibly can. So that's the lowest I would go, and I think that can be a useful intake for hard dieting phases, like I said earlier, that have expiry dates and light at the end of the tunnel, and there's a specific purpose, etc. But I don't think I would ever set up a diet that is purposely lower than 30 grams of fat, as far as on the front end diet setup, and it's typically for a very small person who's relatively sedentary. But phases at the end stage of prep, where we're in the 20 to 30 gram range, and the person has shown that they do better with a low fat intake while maintaining carbohydrates in terms of functional outcomes in the gym and diet adherence, sure. Not common, but I have done them. I've done it myself. So that's kind of the really rock bottom low end. But the preferable low end is when you look at data on, like I mentioned earlier, when do you start to see slight suboptimal hormonal levels, drops in estrogen in women, drops in testosterone in men. And that's kind of roughly around like 20% of calories.
Mm.
Now, obviously, I don't actually think this operates as a quote unquote percentage of calories. And it's probably has more to do with, if you were to take those meta-analyses, figure out the average caloric intake of the people involved, and then figure out the absolute amount associated with that 20% of calories, where are we at? And if we assume kind of like 2,000-ish to 2,500 calories for women and men respectively on average, which kind of lines up with what our recommended intakes are for relatively sedentary people, now we're looking at something like 40 to 60 grams of fat is kind of our low end. So when you set up a diet with someone who prefers a higher carb intake, lower fat intake, that's generally the range you would fall in for most body sizes. Very high body mass or very low body masses, that might be something like 30 or 70. You're talking about a 5'1" bikini competitor or a 6'2" heavyweight bodybuilder who's got a lot of mass on them. A low fat diet, especially if they have a high energy expenditure, might be 70 grams, right? So yeah, that's kind of the ranges. And Trexler, again, did a great job. I direct people to his article in Mass, but it was also a really good cover story. So you can find that on Stronger by Science if you want to read that story and trace back all the references. It's pretty well done work, and it is actively going to influence the third edition of my muscle and strength pyramids as far as setting up fat intake, which is kind of neat.
Yeah, that's cool. It's good to know that. I mean, it's not like a hard and fast number that we had thought necessarily.
No. Yeah, I used to operate off of 0.5 grams per kilogram, which will get you in the range of like his low end, not the low end, like bile, production preventative, but like the 20 to 30 gram range for most people will get you slightly above that, somewhere between that and the 40 to 60 gram range. So yeah, I think you absolutely can. If you're someone who loves carbs, you can set yourself up on a, like 50 grams of fat and 1.6 grams or 1.8 grams per kg of protein, and then be like, all right, the rest is carbs. And that's a viable way to go. You can also, however, go, all right, I prefer to set myself up with a minimal intake of carbohydrate, somewhere around 2 grams per kg, and then my protein at 1.8, and then just whatever's left for fat. And your mileage may vary. I have experienced that some people do better with one way or the other. And some people will have to go even outside of those norms to get an optimal result. It's just very difficult to know without experience.
So ultimately, you don't necessarily see, like, you don't have a preference between either approach in terms of, like, when we're playing in these like rock bottom levels, say like late in prep, where what's the last man to sacrifice?
Yeah, generally not. That's super individual. And I actually find that choosing one for a client, unless they're a rank novice and they just don't know, is generally less advisable than giving them the option. I have shifted my perspective. I used to say, hey, protein and calories is fine for general diets, but tracking all 3 macros is better. It's more precise for physique competitions. I actually think that's backwards now, that a physique competitor generally, if they're actually dieting, they should have far more of that skill set we talked about for dieting. And you're giving them more tools by saying, hey, here's a calorie range and here's a protein minimum threshold. Adapt that to your situation, how you're feeling, your life, your needs, the environment you're in. And that will result in more optimal outcomes because it allows the person living in their own body who's an experienced dieter to auto-regulate their intake. If they're feeling like absolute crap from meal 3 to meal 4 and they need a piece of fruit, just to kind of get them through and normalize their blood sugar levels, they can do that. But if you had them on, too low of carbohydrates and they can't, they may not feel the same way if they grabbed a handful of nuts and then had to have just, less fat later in the day or whatever, So you're restricting their options potentially in a way that actually doesn't facilitate the best auto-regulation, especially in a situation like contest prep where you can just have these varied lethargy spells that don't really have solid predictability, and you don't want it to occur when you're trying to go to the gym, or go to work or something like that.
Yeah, fascinating. Yeah, that's an interesting perspective where experience also is adds another level of complexity, where when you're talking about prep athletes, you're automatically assuming that they're advanced or, they're a higher level, and you like having flexibility in a system is actually another added advantage. That's like an independent variable, and
Absolutely.
Giving someone some flexibility or the ability to auto-regulate these variables actually gives you more control and can be more optimal.
Yep. It's built-in individualization.
Sweet. So yeah, just wrapping up this discussion, I think that was awesome in terms of getting into some fat loss nitty gritty. We'll continue the discussion of the other layers of the pyramid later. I wanted to save a few minutes to get a prep update from Eric.
Yes, sir. So I weighed in this morning after my 2-day refeed. My current structure dieting is I have 5 low days and then 2 high days. I am, as we record this, it is Monday, the 11th of September in New Zealand. I'm competing on the 30th, so I am basically just under 3 weeks out, which is
getting close.
Exciting. Yeah, getting real close. And I weighed 82 kilos this morning. So that's after 2 refeeds, which is a pretty low weigh-in for me after 2 refeeds. I'm looking pretty damn close to ready. I do have glute striations from the side. My hamstrings are striated. The quads are striated. And I've got some glutes from the back, like kind of the couple bottom slashes and that big mid glute dent. And I think in the next 2.5 weeks that will come in all the way, and then we'll probably actually do like a proper I wouldn't say a peak, but like a couple of high days maybe, and then moderate days instead of low days afterwards, unlike my normal diet, to come into the first show if I had to predict, and ride sodium a little bit to try to get that fullness versus carbohydrates primarily, to make sure that I am in shape and have fully everything I need to be competitive on stage. And then after that, we're going to see where the chips fall. So there are a variable numbers of shows I'll be doing from 3 to 5 this year. My first planned 2 shows are both amateur shows that are pro qualifiers. So if the first one goes very well, WNBF New Zealand, shout out to Simon Collins and Stephanie Collins for running that. I was a judge at it last year, really excited to be on the other side of the table this time. If it goes really well and I happen to pull off a win, which by no means is even a high probability, there are some awesome athletes in New Zealand, but if the chips do fall my way, then I will not be doing the show the next weekend, which will be the Battle of the Bay, which is a fantastic show, one of the best ones in the Bay Area in California, another amateur show. And then no matter what, I will be doing the next weekend after that. So it's 3 shows in a row, back to back weekends. That is going to be the INBF WNBF Washington Puget Sound, which is a pro-am. And I did this show all the way back in 2009. I went up in the overall against Jeff Albert, who won his pro card there. So I'll be returning to compete again, seeing if I can defend my 14-year-old light heavyweight title, or potentially competing in my first pro show, as it's a pro-am, if either the Battle of the Bay or WNBF New Zealand went well. And then I have 2 more potential shows. There's in Brisbane, October 28th, is the WNBF Australia, another pro qualifier. And if any of the 3 shows beforehand happen to have gone my way, I won't be doing that show. But potentially I will be doing it. And then very last show of the year will be 3 weeks after that, WNBF Worlds. And we'll see how the chips fell. I'll be doing that potentially in the pro division, potentially in the amateur division as a last shot. But yeah, anywhere from 3 to 5 shows. And right now, like I said, I'm 3 4, 5, 7, and 10 weeks out from all those shows.
We're strapping in. This is
That's
exciting.
right. Ain't
This is
no
where
joke.
the fun happens, you know. I mean,
Yes,
you're
sir.
already as lean as you are. There's just a little bit to come off, and then the rest is the little magic finishing touches.
Absolutely. Yeah, I suspect by that third show, we will probably be done with active fat loss, and then the calories will just start coming up. But I'll be getting in, like I won't be having celebratory meals on the Saturdays after my shows, the first three. You know, unless I do win a pro card, then then it all goes out the window. We're like, yeah, more. And I got 2 weeks before the next one if that does happen. But I mean, depending on the timing of it. Like if in the second show, the Battle of the Bay, I win my pro card, and then I got to be on stage 7 days later as a pro. Yeah, the celebratory meal will just be me kissing a WBF pro card like this. That'll be the flavor on my lips. Will be sweet pro status.
Gold.
Yeah. So yeah, it will be an interesting process, but I'll be sneaking in probably dieting for each one of those weeks, and then doing little kind of mid backloads, because my body takes a while to clean up after a carb load. So it'll probably be something like a Wednesday, Thursday high day, and then a Friday midday, and then kind of just riding that with higher sodium intake on Saturdays. Probably what it'll look like. So I'm actually getting in dieting on Sunday, Monday, Tuesday.
Yeah. What are your calories looking like right now on high days and low days?
Good question. So my 2 high days are 2,500. If my step count is normalish, and a little bit lower than that if my step counts doesn't get there, just depending on what I got going on. And then on Mondays and Fridays, I have my lower days, around 1,500 to 1,600 calories. I do that coming off the 2 days of refeeding, because I can sneak it in and I don't feel it. So it's a nice way to get in a low day after being, well fed. And then Friday, it's more of the psychological. You can sneak it in because you're right at the end of the tunnel, and there's 2 high days coming. And then on Tuesday through Thursday, I have a variable intake between like 1,700 to 2,000, depending on how I feel, what I need, whether I'm flat, how my training's going, and how lethargic I am. But basically trying to get as much of a deficit as I can in that range without fatiguing myself, because we do got to make it, like I said, all the way to Worlds. And while it seems like, oh man, you're only 2.5 or almost 3 weeks out, I'm also going all the way to mid-November, and it is, mid-September almost. So we've got to make it a few more months regardless, and you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
And what's your training looking like right now? I remember, earlier we were talking about Eric doing some do not try at home stuff where he was competing in powerlifting, coming into bodybuilding prep.
Yeah, the powerlifting meet went great in June.
Yeah.
So I competed 83, put up a total I was very pleasantly surprised with, because I squatted and deadlifted more than I had in training. And then since then, I've done like a truly minimum effective dose of powerlifting training, so that I can focus a lot more on bodybuilding. So right now, I have like Monday, Wednesday, Friday is calves and upper body. And that's a focus primarily on, I get a little more volume on my lats and delts. That's kind of just the way my body shakes out. And then split between Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. So I train 6 days a week, with Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday being easier. I get one single or a top set of a double or a triple, maybe a few back off sets on squat, bench, and deadlift, or a close variation thereof, and not necessarily every week. So like, for example, this last week I did hack squats and I did RDLs, and I did bench, but I didn't do an actual barbell squat or barbell deadlift. But the last weekend I did, or rather say last week I did. And then I also get a little bit of additional upper body work on those days, just to kind of fill in the gaps to get me to my target volume. So it's like basically 2 upper body exercises, 1 if I did bench, and then a heavy set on squat and deadlift, get out, and then that kind of and plus legs. So I basically have 3 upper days plus calves, and then I have 2 lower body days where I have like 1 direct quad, 1 direct glute ham exercise, or sometimes just like leg curls, and then additionally a squat and a deadlift. And that's kind of how I get on my lower body volume. So for example, this last week I did 3 sets of hacks, 3 sets of leg extensions, 3 sets of leg curls, 3 sets of RDLs, and 3 sets of weighted back extensions. And that was like my lower body work. That wasn't calves. Week before that, I also did some additional sets of squats. So I'm between like 6 to 9 sets per week on quads, glutes, hams, and I'm closer to 15 to 20 sets per week on my upper body, and closer to the top end of that for delts and lats.
So I think your volumes sound pretty similar still to what you were doing before, like in the off season.
Yep, pretty much.
Cool, advanced stuff.
I haven't really had the need to drop them too much. And I think it's also important that as the kids call it, my SFR has improved post training for powerlifting now. Like I do a lot more machine work now and capable. So I'm much more comfortable maintaining those volumes because it's not requiring me I don't have to do a lot of bench, squat, deadlift, so yeah.
Yeah, I find that to be a big relief when you back away a little bit from the heavy barbell stuff and take advantage of machines later in prep.
100%.
Sweet. I love how we're able to have the like highest level educational content from Eric, but also get into the like elite athlete shit, at the end. It's great.
I love it, sir. Always fun to talk about it. I appreciate the platform.
Yeah. So anyways, you'll have to wait with bated breath until our next prep update from Eric, and we're going to wrap this one up. Where can people find you, Eric?
You can find me at 3dmusclejourney.com if you want more content for drug-free bodybuilding as well as powerlifting. We've just got a recent course actually launched in the 3DMJ Vault, and it is called Bodybuilding Program Design. Part 1 is now out, and that's me talking all about volume, intensity, frequency, and how to structure your training to have a customized approach for you. So I would encourage people to check out the Vault. Go to 3dmusclejourney.com, and you can find it there. And sign up for that course. It's really, really good, and you can see how I landed on my training approach. Instead of starting with the split and trying to shoehorn your individual needs into it, like a push-pull legs or an upper-lower, you start with what does each one of my muscle groups need, what exercises are best, how many sets, and then the split emerges from that. This is basically how powerlifters program. Like, what are my squat, bench, and deadlift needs, and how do I distribute that in the week to facilitate recovery? Yet for some reason, bodybuilders don't know how to do that. They don't get it. They go, all right, let me just pick a push-pull legs, and then I'll try to put my needs into it. So it's high time that bodybuilders actually got the programming skills that we see on the other side of the fence in our powerlifting brethren and sistren.
Sweet. So I'll put that link in the description below so you can check it out. Thanks again for being on the show, Eric.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.